Theory of a multipolar world and other paradigms of IR. 1. The relevance of realism to the TMW. After their originality and difference from existing approaches in IR have been distinctly specified and clarified, civilization as the basic actor in IR and the TMW built on this basis can, on a new level, be related to existing theories, but now not as derivatives, but as a new independent paradigm with other, already existing paradigms. This juxtaposition will help us outline more fully the specific character of the TMW and its structure, and will help us study an even more important point, the clarification of how relations between civilizations can form in theory and whether conflict, as Huntington thought, or dialogue, as Katami or Petitot thought, will prevail. Realism is for the actors of civilizations. The realist paradigm, operating with the norms of the Westphalian system and advancing as an actor nation-states, is straightforwardly entirely inapplicable to the TMW. The difference in actors presupposes an entirely different understanding of the milieu of international relations. If we apply the realist paradigm literally, we will see that instead of a map of civilizations and large spaces we will have a political map of the world, where civilizational zones are divided, often artificially, into a series of nation-states, while some states are the intersection of two or more civilizations. Realists insist that the state is a wolf to states, or, in the extreme case, they recognize the hierarchical relations of hegemony. But such an approach blocks any attempt to integrate large spaces on a civilizational basis. Consequently, in its pure form, realism is unacceptable and inapplicable. Supporters of the TMW find themselves in this case in polemics against the representatives of classical realism and neorealism. But if we take civilizations as the main actors of international relations, fixed in large spaces, we get an entirely different picture. In this case, we can imagine intercivilizational relations as a direct analog to the structure of the international sphere in the realist paradigm. Here we should also postulate chaos and anarchy, but on a new level, as intercivilizational chaos and intercivilizational anarchy. Repeating the logic of the realists, we can say that there is no supercivilizational level in the TMW and no universal scale of values that could act as a generally accepted norm in relations among civilizations. The civilizational, multipolar approach presumes the complete uniqueness of each civilization, and it is not possible to find a common denominator for them all. This is the essence of multipolarity as pluriverse. Each civilization itself formulates and presents its concept of man, society, norm, truth, knowledge, being, time, space, God, world, history, politics, etc. So, dialogue between civilizations is possible to the same extent as conflict, but impossible is the transition from several civilizations to a single one. Consequently, on this level the TMW can fully borrow the logic of traditional realists, rejecting the ontology and stability of international institutions and norms, but apply it to an entirely different environment, not international, interstate, but intercivilizational. Changing the subject of the world order means changing its, i.e. the order's qualitative content. If realists think that all states strive to optimize their interests and rationalize the means and mechanisms of their accomplishment, in the case of civilizations this reductionist schema does not work. Civilizations can have entirely different goals and motivations. Some are inclined to expand, others, to maximize their material power, others, to technological development, others, to contemplation, others, to preserve themselves in isolation, others, to active dialogue with the surrounding world and the exchange of cultural forms. Here, a thin approach to IR is not at all suitable, since the civilization as subject is so multidimensional and unique, original and peculiar, that a thick approach becomes not simply desirable, but necessary and obligatory. Modeling the profile of a civilization is a unique task every time, and clarifying general features can only happen a posteriori, not a priori. This is a second limitation of realism. If realists understand the principles of self-help and national interests as a general rule of parameters characteristic of practically all nation-states, the TMW insists that among civilizations the list of basic parameters is much broader and voluminous, and also more diverse. Thus, both chaos and anarchy in the intercivilizational sphere acquire a more complex structure. It is not simply a field of struggle of approximately identical actors with different power potentials and a similar system of interests and aims, but a multidimensional and multilayered labyrinth, where nonlinear regularities, strange attractors, and the phenomenon of turbulence are at work. The composition of the map of intercivilizational anarchy is a much more complicated matter than the analysis of anarchy in classical realism, and even in neorealism. But with these two fundamental corrections, many logical aspects of realism can be successfully set in motion in the elaboration of a TMW. In particular, the most important borrowing from classical realism can be the critique of the possibility of supracivilizational institutions. Neorealism, with its inclination to build a structural system based on the balance of power, can full well be applied to a multipolar world order, which in its basic parameters will also be organized in accordance with the power potential of the main actors, only, they will be civilizations in the given case. In a certain sense, civilizations as poles of a multipolar world will be regional hegemonies, with all the consequences that follow from this. At the same time, there must be more than three such hegemonies. Neorealist constructions, which study precisely hegemonic models as a priority, can be very useful in building a TMW. And Waltz's theory about the stability of a bipolar model, which is now on the periphery, refuted by the facts of the 80s and 90s, can be introduced anew in the constitution of a multipolar model, put in place of a bipolar one. 2. The relevance of liberalism to the TMW. The TMW can borrow separate aspects from the liberal paradigm, too. Liberalism insists that similar political regimes, although they only speak of liberal democracies, are inclined to integrate and to consolidate multilayered socio-cultural, economic, and network ties, with the prospect of also shared supranational institutions. The culture of political democracy creates the conditions for overcoming national egoism. If we cast off the universalism typical for the West of the practically ethnocentric appeal to democracy, we get the thesis: societies with similar cultures are inclined to integration and the creation of supranational structures. If we apply this to the zone of shared civilization, we will find ourselves on the wave of the TMW. Indeed, integrational processes and the creation of superstate structures on the basis of a shared socio-cultural matrix occur more easily than in other cases. In the context of a civilization, it is not so much the political regime of the state, democracy, as culture, and often religion, that matters. Thus, relations between states with a common culture, religion, are built according to a completely different logic than relations between states with different cultures. A commonality of culture is for the TWM a necessary condition for successful integration into a shared large space and, accordingly, for the creation of a pole of a multipolar world. The significance of the cultural factor as not less important than the principle of sovereignty brings the supporters of the TMW closer to liberals than to classical realists, who insist on the sovereignty of precisely nation-states without taking into account the cultural factor. Schmidt and other institutional realists are an exception, in particular several representatives of the English school of IR. But this proximity is actual only when emphasis on the political regime, democracy, is replaced by emphasis on belonging to a common culture, religion. The liberal paradigm, and especially neoliberalism and transnationalism, pay much attention to processes of globalization. In practice, globalization has a few stages. First, regional integration occurs, then universal, planetary integration. But for liberals in IR, regional globalization is only a transitional condition and preliminary phase of worldwide globalization, lacking any particular value and only preparing the way for the sought-after outcome, the onset of a global world and the end of history. The TMW, for its part, supports regional globalization and integration for the reason that these processes in practice always occur in the borders of some concrete civilization. Arguments among the countries of the European Union about accepting Turkey into the supranational structure clearly show that even among Europeans who ignore all religio-cultural aspects of the identity of society, the sensation of the foreignness of Turks provokes serious apprehension. But if for liberals and globalists this is a temporary difficulty, supporters of the TMW, by contrast, conceptualize precisely regional integration, which they regard as an independent and finished process, whole in itself, and moreover do not propose any other integrational phases after it. In accordance with the spirit of multipolarity, regional integration is thought of not as a step or phase of planetary globalization, but as an autonomous historico-political, strategic, and social process, having its end in itself. Integration must end with the attainment of the civilization's natural borders. After this, the phase begins of specifying the proportions and systems of influence in the zone of the frontier. Regional globalization brings supporters of the TMW closer to liberals in IR, while their attitude toward planetary globalization, by contrast, divides them. But if we accept these two fundamental corrections, cultural unity instead of the unity of political regimes and regional globalization instead of planetary globalization, supporters of the TMW can full well borrow arguments from representatives of the liberal theory of IR, especially when it is necessary to refute the theories of realists strictly holding to a state-centric approach. Moreover, liberals developed a number of themes that are also relevant for the TMW. In the first place, this is the idea of peace or a zone of peace, which is a priority center of attention for IR liberals. If we look at history, we will notice that the concept peace has everywhere been connected with a necessary specification, which peace exactly? We know Pax Romana, Pax Turcica, Pax Britannica, Pax Russica, and, finally, the contemporary Pax Americana. This word usage of the term peace with an addition that specifies whose peace it is, who is responsible for it and for the preservation of order, is very revealing. If we relate this addition to civilizations, we will get a multipolar theory of peace, in the sense of pax, peace, consisting of several zones where peace will reign, based each time on concrete civilizational principles. We get Pax Atlantica, consisting of Pax Americana and Pax Europea, Pax Eurasiatica, Pax Islamica, Pax Sinica, Pax Hindica, Pax Nipponica, Pax Latina, and later Pax Buddhistica, Pax Africana. These zones of civilizational peace, as the absence of war, and general security can be taken as the basic concepts of multipolar pacifism. The task of civilizations as actors of international relations is in the first place to make them zones of stable peace, since in the opposite case they will not be able to act in a consolidated manner at a global level. At the same time, multipolar peace, Pax Multipolaris, should have its own ontology in the context of international relations. It assumes simultaneously a supranational, superstate level, which is why there is international and foreign peace with regard to the state, but not universal and not planetary, i.e. internal, with regard to civilizations. The second important point for the TMW consists in the neoliberal concept of interdependence and expansion of the list of actors. Here we should also move everything liberals say about all humanity to the level of civilization. Civilization assumes the presence of a socio-cultural, geopolitical, and economic zone, where there are closely intertwined structures and communities relating to the civilization, and to a much greater extent than under conditions of division by national borders. In the TMW, civilizational networks replace global networks, but their functions remain very similar in other respects. In a civilization, various levels of socio-political, economic, and cultural systems intertwine, forming a much more complex and nonlinear map of society than in classical bourgeois models of the political nation. This, a kind of civilizational turbulence, demands a nonlinear approach and detailed description of each separate segment. In a civilization, the interdependence of social groups and strata forms a complex game of plural identities, superimposed on one another, coming apart and together into new knots. A shared civilizational code, for instance, religion, produces the frame conditions, but within these borders there can be a significant degree of variation. Part of identity can be based on tradition, but part is an innovative construction, since civilization in the TMW is thought of as a living historical organism in the process of constant transformations. As in liberalism, the TMW recognizes behind the individuals of a concrete civilization a non-zero degree of competence in international questions, at least within the confines of the civilization. Individual identity here is strictly marked by culture, and in this culture the individual can always obtain the fundamental knowledge necessary to form a point of view concerning concrete civilizational questions. Thus, in the TMW on the individual level of an ordinary member of society, we are most likely dealing with Rosnaw's skilled individual, rather than with the lambda individual of realists. Only the competence of this skilled individual is defined not by personal access to a broad spectrum of non-codified information, as among transnationalists and globalists, but by belonging to a semantic field of tradition. 3. The relevance of the English school to the TMW. The English school of IR is extremely productive for the construction of a sociology of intercivilizational interaction. Representatives of this school examine the sphere of international relations as a society, and, accordingly, they gave priority to the study of the procedures and protocols of the socialization of countries in the sphere of international relations, i.e. to international socialization. They thereby supplied IR theorists with an arsenal of methods, intended for the deep study of the regularities of the interactions of actors in international relations. In the TMW, the actors change, instead of states, they are civilizations. At the same time, the structure of the sphere of international relations also changes. Accordingly, the methods of the English school can be taken as a basis for studying the intercivilizational socium, the ensemble of civilizations and the structures of dialogue occurring among them. The thesis of the dialogue of civilizations acquires in the English school a concrete content. This dialogue can be thought of as a strategy of socialization, a dynamic of gradient relations, rhythms of exclusion/inclusion, attempts to hierarchize the system of relations, expansion and retreat, protocols of war and peace, material and spiritual balance, etc. In a multipolar world, civilizations will be a planetary society, required in one way or another to acknowledge an other alongside it. But in this case the other will not be a state, but a civilization other than the given one. How the figure of the other will be structured, to what extent it will have negative and pejorative traits, and to what extent it can be considered in the spirit of peaceful competition and partnership, will depend on many factors, which it is not possible to foretell. But the conceptual instruments of the English school are theoretically wonderfully useful for further theory construction. As an example, we can take the model of the Islamic world in the contemporary West. A certain demonization of Islam as a civilization, especially after 9/11, became a characteristic civilizational cliché in the West, independent of what country is at issue and on what basis this negative model is formed, whether on the basis of Christian identity or pure secularism. Something analogous is characteristic also for Americophobia and the general hostility toward the West in the Islamic world, and again, independently of what concrete state is at issue. We are dealing with a distribution of social statuses and roles on the level of international relations, and this to a significant extent is studied as a priority by the English school in IR, which puts at the center of attention the society of states and the social aspects of their interaction, inter-recognition, and inter-estimation. The methods of the English school will be acceptable in the TMW. Instead of the society of states, we will study the society of civilizations and the sociological processes occurring in this society. 4. The relevance of Marxism and Neo-Marxism to the TMW. Marxism and Neo-Marxism in IR are very useful for the TMW as a doctrinal arsenal for the critique of the universalism of Western civilization and its pretensions to moral superiority, based on the factor of material, technological, and financial superiority. Western civilization in modernity took the path of capitalism and reached the furthest horizons of this path. But the material embodiment of success on the highest level of economic development and effectiveness of market procedures, and in recent times in the high-priority development of the financial sector, can serve as a decisive argument only if we agree to accept capital as the standard not only of material, but also social, cultural, and spiritual values. Weber showed this wonderfully when he identified capitalism as the expression of the Protestant ethic, where man's reward during life by riches and success is regarded as a direct reflection of his moral worth. The sign of equality between prosperity and morality as a distinctive mark of the Western society of modernity thus has religious and cultural sources. Capital and capitalism proved to be not simply the standard of might, but the standard of right. From the start, Marxism challenges this approach and, acknowledging the power of capital, denies it the right of moral superiority. Marxist ethics are arranged in a precisely opposite way. Good are labor and the laboring class, the proletariat, which under capitalism is fully enslaved by the parasite class of the bourgeoisie. Rich for Marxism means bad. Consequently, material development or the concentration of capital in some countries or others does not simply prove nothing, but proves that at issue are the most unjust and hence wicked societies, which must be destroyed. In IR analysis, this Marxist ethics leads to the moral evaluation of the rich North and the core of the capitalist world system as the historic, geographic, social expression of global evil. The West becomes not a model for imitation and longing, a promised land, where all questions receive their answer, but as the citadel of exploitation, lies, violence, and injustice. Without sharing dogmatically all the conclusions regarding world revolution and the messianic destiny of the proletariat, the TMW accepts the Marxist approach to the evaluation of the capitalist nature of the West and solidarizes with the denunciation of capitalism as an asymmetrical model of exploitation and the imposition of the West's civilizational criteria: capitalism, the free market, the pursuit of gain, materialism, consumerism, etc., on all other peoples and societies. Capitalism is the material, economic side of Western universalism and Western colonialism. Accepting the logic of capital, we are automatically obligated sooner or later to recognize the West and its civilization as the reference point, the model for imitation, and the horizon of development. But this is directly opposed to the idea of a multipolar world order and to the value pluralism of civilizations. For some civilizations, material prosperity and capitalist forms of economy are acceptable and desirable, but for other civilizations it is possible that they are not at all so. Capitalism is not obligatory and is not the only form of organizing an economy. It can be accepted or refused. Identifying material prosperity with moral worth can be justified by some and rejected by others. Hence, for the TMW, the anti-capitalist vector of Marxism and Neo-Marxism in IR, and also the unmasking of exploitative procedures characteristic of dependent development, is an important element and can full well be accepted as a tool. The same thing is also suitable for the critique of the rich North and the call to oppose the core of the world system. Without this opposition, the emergence of a multipolar world is impossible. The main difference between the TMW and Neo-Marxism and world systems theory, as well as the projects of Negri and Hart and other alter-globalists, is that the TMW categorically rejects the historical fatalism of Marxist theories, which insist that capitalism is a universal and necessary phase of historical development, after which the proletarian revolution must follow, just as fatefully and necessarily. For the TMW, capitalism is an empirically fixed form of development of Western European civilization, which grew out of the roots of Western European culture and has acquired today an almost planetary scope. but a deep analysis of capitalism in non-Western societies shows that in them it has an entirely imitative and superficial character, possesses other semantic characteristics, and is always something special and distinct from the socio-economic formations that prevail in the contemporary West. Capitalism arose in the West, and there it can either develop further or die. But its expansion beyond the limits of the Western world, although conditional on capital's striving to grow, is completely unjustified from the perspective of the non-Western societies on which it is projected. Each civilization can have its own time, its own notion of history, its own vision of the economy and material development. Capitalism invades non-Western societies as a continuation of colonial practice, and, consequently, can and should be rejected, reversed, as the aggression of a foreign culture or foreign civilization. Hence, the TMW insists that the battle against the rich North should proceed today by all subjects of the political map of humanity, and especially the countries of the Second World, Wallerstein's semi-periphery. The multipolar world should come not after liberalism, as Neo-Marxists think, but instead of liberalism. Thus, the battle against liberalism should be carried out not in the name of what comes after it once it has been consolidated on a global scale, but already today, so that it will never be consolidated on a global scale. It is not necessary for non-Western civilizations to pass through the capitalist phase of development. Just as it is not necessary to mobilize one's population for the proletariat revolution. The elites and masses of the countries of the semi-periphery, contrary to neo-Marxists, are not at all required to separate and integrate into two international classes, the global proletariat and the global bourgeoisie, losing all their civilizational features. On the contrary, the elites and masses belonging to one or another civilization must recognize their shared civilizational identity, the significance of which should be weightier than the significance of class identity. If, as regards the international solidarity of the bourgeoisie and, to a lesser extent, the proletariat, Marxists are sometimes right, since at issue are the capitalist societies and bourgeois states, where indeed the logic of capital prevails, appeal to some other, non-Western civilization qualitatively changes everything. The elites and masses of the Islamic world, for instance, are much more keenly aware of their shared belonging to Islamic culture than to their class proximity to the elites and masses of other civilizations, Western in particular. And this unity should not be washed out and shaken loose, by liberal cosmopolitanism and neo-Marxist or anarchist class internationalism, but consolidated, developed, and supported. The multipolar world, especially in its first, anti-hegemonic phase, should be built on the solidarity of all civilizations in opposition to the colonial and globalist practices of the rich North. And this struggle should rally elites and masses within the civilizations, the more so since applying purely class criteria to them, elites as bourgeoisie, masses as proletariat, is the projection of a Western hegemonic approach. In non-Western civilizations there are without doubt empirically higher and lower strata, but their sociological and cultural semantics differ significantly from the reducti. The reductionist models, where the most important and sole criterion is relation to the ownership of the means of production. Hence, the TMW appeals to the civilizational solidarity of elites and masses in the shared construction of the pole of a multipolar world and the organization of a large space in accordance with the historical and cultural peculiarities of each separate society. 5. The relevance of critical theory to the TMW. Post-positivist IR theories are very productive for the TMW. IR critical theory can be put to work practically in its entirety for the denunciation of Western hegemony. The critique of West-centric pretensions, global capitalism, liberal globalization, and the unipolar world in this theory correspond to the main attitudes of the TMW and are a necessary part of it. Without clear recognition of the hegemonic nature of the present system of international relations and its essential unipolarity, however it might be expressed directly, indirectly, or tacitly, the need for an alternative cannot be justified. The TMW represents from the start a radical alternative to precisely the existing hegemony. Thus, the detailed and thorough description of its structures, its methods of consolidation, and its concealment of its essence, as well as its unmasking, are very important elements of the TMW. Critical theory in IR, Cox, in the first place, is a model of such a frontal attack, the main points of which can be fully integrated into the TMW. This concerns both the structuralist and the linguistic analysis of hegemony. The conception, stemming from the critique of hegemony, of a contra-hegemonic bloc can be taken into the ammunition of the TMW. At the same time, the concept of a contra-hegemonic bloc acquires in the TMW more concrete and systemized features than in the inertially Marxist critical theory. The contra-hegemonic bloc in the TMW is the totality of those powers in all presently existing civilizations which recognize the current state of hegemony as unacceptable and failing to meet the interests of peoples and societies. The core of the contra-hegemonic bloc should be avant-garde intellectuals, who represent the main civilizations that claim to be an independent pole, which under the present hegemonic conditions is harshly denied them a priori, Orthodox, Eurasian, Islamic, Chinese, Hindu, Latin American, and also Buddhist, Japanese, and African. Within Western civilization it is also entirely possible for intellectual circles to unite in that regard Western civilization, American and European, as local and regional and prefer to limit the zone of their expansion by their historical limits, supporters of American isolation or the Project Fortress Europe. On the second level, the core of the contra-hegemonic bloc can be all the forces that oppose globalization and the unipolar world on some other basis, for instance, class, ethnic, cultural, religious, or ideological. But if we take into account that in the construction of a contra-hegemonic bloc the supporters of a multipolar world, the whole family of intellectuals and theoreticians, will rely on the gigantic potential of their civilizations and not only on the moral rejection of hegemony, this bloc will instantly transform into something much more serious than we can imagine if we take into account only our impressions from the texts and suggestions of Western theorists, who as a rule represent nonconformist and marginal groups. Dialogue with contra-hegemonists of all types, belonging to all groups and cultural zones, is, undoubtedly, extremely important, but the priority is consolidation of precisely the members of the strong and regionally sound civilizational powers. Only in combination with the TMW does critical theory transform from a noble intellectual game and morally heroic position into an imposing political force. 6. The relevance of postmodern theory to the TMW. No less important is postmodernism in IR, first of all for the systematic deconstruction of the power discourse with the help of which Western hegemony presents itself as something natural, without alternatives, and alone possible. The entire structure of the theorization of the field of international relations in Western political science, to say nothing of the political discourses concerning international questions among Western politicians, is a well-organized field of self-fulfilling prophecies, problem-solving theories, and wishful thinking. IR theories and the global discourse of Western leaders is a kind of neurolinguistic programming, called on to impose on humanity through text the model of reality that is always organized to satisfy the interests of the Western elite. Knowledge, postmodernists in IR emphasize, cannot be objective and neutral. And the exposure of or another theory serves as the unique and extremely useful instrument of deconstruction in IR. Sometimes this act is called subversive, since it helps to highlight the strained arguments, figures of omission, and double standards, with which are replete theoretical texts and all the more so political declarations describing the logic of processes in international relations and thereby predetermining them. On the whole, postmodernists follow the same line as critical theorists, unmasking and exhibiting the hegemonic nature of the West and its totalitarian discourse, used to impose Western interests and values on all other societies, despite the fact that the population of the West represents a minority of humanity and its culture is neither the most ancient nor the most perfect, if we can apply a value scale to civilizations at all. Postmodernism in IR is extremely useful also in getting out from under the prejudices of empiricism, verification, statistical significance, etc., characteristic residues of the overcome belief of the modern epoch in the independent ontological object. On the level of the philosophy of science and sociology, the idea that the criterion of scienticity is the verifiability of the fact in practice has long since been refuted and replaced by other, more precise criteria, falsification in particular, Popper, Lakatos. I.e. the recognition as scientific of a hypothesis that can be disposed of by a rational system of proofs. Other epistemologists spoke of paradigm shifts, Kuhn, or the proliferation of hypotheses, Feyerabend, as the main signs of scienticity. These philosophical elaborations were introduced into IR later, but postmodernists remedy this shortcoming, bringing the self-reflection of IR specialists to the required level. In postmodern epistemology, there are no facts, objects, or subjects. There are only processes, aleatory codes, structures, networks, hybrids, Latour, or rhizomes, Deleuze. And they can all either organize around the axis of the will to power or weaken and be left to themselves. Here we can mark one important difference between IR postmodernism and the TMW. So long as at issue is the critique of Western hegemony and the West's will to power through unmasking structures of domination and establishing inequalities on the level of discourse and theory, both theories go hand in hand. The TMW fully acknowledges the arsenal of postmodern criticism and borrows its basic methods of deconstruction. The deconstruction of hegemony is accepted fully. The difference begins where postmodernists advance their alternative project. It amounts most often to the demand for complete repudiation of the will to power altogether, from any hierarchy, and appeal to a general, relaxed chaos, in which any hierarchical geometry of being, knowledge, society, politics, materiality, gender, production practices, etc., dies out and is erased. Deconstructing the power of the West, postmodernists strive thereby to overthrow the principle of hierarchy altogether. The TMW does not share this pathos. It thinks that the deconstruction of the will to power of the West is very useful for clearing the field for the creation of a TMW, and, accordingly, for the construction of a multipolar world as such. It does not get rid of the will to power as a phenomenon, and with it any hierarchical geometry of the world, but relativizes this will, demonopolizes the West in its pretensions to being the sole bearer of the will to power and imposing its Western, today, liberal capitalist, version of this will on everyone else. The Western will to power exists, and it really predetermines the structure of the entire Western discourse. The sphere of IR and its theoretical comprehension is organized in accordance with this. More precisely, comprehension organizes this sphere through its theoretical comprehension. Osmyslini organizuit etus reductores y theoreticus co Osmyslini. But after revealing and acknowledging this, we can draw conclusions different from those that postmodernists draw. Without denying this will altogether, we should limit it by the natural, historical and geographic limits of Western civilization and allow it within these limits to either assert itself, transform itself, or slide into the networks and tubers of turbulent society. This is a choice for the West. But the choice for other civilizations, Eurasian, Islamic, Chinese, Hindu, etc., can well consist in defending the right to cultivate their own version of the will to power, built on the basis of historical traditions, cultures, religions, social particularities, etc. The orthodox, Chinese, Islamic, or Hindu versions of the will to power might differ from each other and from the European one, and each of them has every reason to secure, change, mutate, or scatter. In each civilization, the will to power can have its own fate. After freeing themselves from the global influence of the hegemonic discourse of the West and compulsion to its full imitation, to the point of a caricature, civilizations will receive a tremendous degree of freedom to act with the autochthonous structures of the will to power according to their own discretion. But here, too, there should be no universal pretensions, including postmodern ones. The will to power can be accepted or rejected, this is up to each concrete society. but it is necessary to become free from the sole hegemonic will to power of the modern capitalist West. 7. The relevance of feminist theory to the TMW. Feminism in IR has great methodological value for the TMW inasmuch as it demonstrates how sociological position, in this case, gender position, affects theoretical constructs. Especially valuable is standpoint feminism, which clearly proves the possibility of a radical reconsideration of sociopolitical theories if they are built in a different sociological starting point, in this case, not from the male, but from the female standpoint. As a result, we get an entirely distinct theory, having little in common with what is generally accepted. Thus, pretensions to universality of one-sided, here, masculine, discourses are undermined. The TMW suggests repeating this approach, placing at the basis of theory not another gender, but another civilizational identity. This gives us a standpoint civilizational approach. If for Western civilization Hobbes's anthropological principle man is a wolf to man can work and become the foundation for further political science constructions, right up to the concept of the Leviathan, sovereignty, the nation-state, and the anarchy of international relations, or can be contested by the more humane and pacifistic positions of Locke and Kant, then in the context of any other civilization we are dealing with an entirely different anthropology, connected with essentially different basic notions of the human and human nature. For instance, in Hinduism the principle operates that man is God to man, in Orthodox ethics, that you are greater than I, and in the Islamic religion, there are no differences between one and another before Allah. Everywhere, different realities serve as the measure of things, somewhere everything is measured by man, somewhere else not, and man is thought of as derived from a different substance. For instance, in Buddhism the individual is an accidental stream of intertwining dharmas and does not have his own nature or I, hence the Buddhist principle of anatman. We should take some concrete anthropological point of view, but not that of Western civilization, and we will get an entirely new conception of the state, power, society, history, and international and interstate relations and ties, differing much more from the Western one than the male perspective does from the female one within the framework of Western civilization. So, feminism in IR can serve as an illustration of the sociological pluralism of starting positions, which can be applied in an entirely new context. As for the demand of feminists to broaden the presence of the female principle in IR theorizing, precisely this is not necessarily reproduced in the TMW. Besides the fact that male and female perspectives on the world vary significantly in the context of one or another civilization, which feminists rightly indicate, suggesting that we study and take these variations into account, different civilizations construct the gender pair in different ways, also on the basis of a unique anthropology peculiar to them. For instance, depriving the Hindu woman of the right to enter a sacrificial fire voluntarily after the death of her husband, the Sati right, fixed in the legislation of contemporary India, which copied the legal codes of Western countries, can full well be considered an infringement of the rights of the Hindu woman, while among Europeans of both sexes this right will likely only inspire horror and aversion. In different civilizations, the semantic content of gender differs fundamentally, and the question of the place of women in society should be resolved on the basis of local social traditions and foundations. If feminists fight against men's efforts to pass off their gender archetypes and attitudes as something universal, they should judge in the same way the attempt to pass off as universal any values with a historical and local origin, including the idea of the equality of sexes, which in its contemporary form is an undoubtedly purely Western, modern, and partially postmodern concept. 8. The relevance of historical sociology to the TMW. Also highly relevant for the TMW is the method of historical sociology in IR, since it allows us to examine the contemporary evolution of the entire system of international relations in a historical perspective and thus to broaden the horizons of the future and make possible a new, deeper comprehension of history. The members of this school in IR criticize classical theories for their lack of a historical dimension. This means that These theories do not pay enough attention to the evolution of actors, acting units, and leading principles that predetermine the interactions of states and societies in various historical stages. Thinking that today's state of affairs in one way or another repeats what has always been, and projecting the present status quo onto the past, the tempocentrism and chronocentrism of the majority of IR theories, classical IR paradigms close the possibility of understanding the past and condemn the future to repeat the same mechanical regularities. The loss of the historical sense leads the majority of IR theorists to inadequate prognosis and analyses, a clear case of which is the total inability of neorealists and neoliberals to predict the collapse of the bipolar world and the fall of the USSR literally right before these fundamental events became realized facts. The structure of international relations was once qualitatively different from what it is now, and it is entirely likely that in the near future it will become qualitatively different from what exists today. To predict and project the future and to understand the past, specific theoretical tools are necessary in the sphere of IR, which historical sociology develops. One version of a historico-sociological approach is offered by the famous theoreticians of this approach, Buzyn and Little. They introduce the concept of an international system and trace the fundamental changes of this system in various historical stages. The essence of their theory amounts to the following. There are four kinds of international system. System is something irreversible and just for all societies of the world. Even where countries were originally included in this system as European colonies, they gradually receive independence and acquire national sovereignty. But that is only how things stand superficially. Under the thin film of the modernization of the political systems in the majority of non-Western countries, an entirely different socio-cultural model is preserved, corresponding as a rule to precisely the classical or ancient international system. Modernization is spread over the top layers of society, but the majority remain in a condition of traditional society. Thus, the former colonial societies that received independence are only formally sovereign, and, accordingly, only formally full-fledged actors of the Westphalian system. Essentially, they remain traditional societies, as before. Precisely this factor becomes apparent when a bipolar world collapses. From under the thin veneer of modernization, the contours of the real content of many socio-cultural regions appear. Here one detects the increasing significance and role of all the indicators that comprise the distinct features of traditional society, religion, ethics, the family, the ethnos, eschatology, etc. This is the phenomenon of the emergence of civilizations, when after the collapse of the structure of modernity, bipolarity, the content of pre-modernity arises, the clash or dialogue of civilizations. In the terms of the historical sociology approach in IR, this is described as the disclosure of the signs of a classical international system in the transition from a global international system to a postmodern one. The globalizing world, intending to take a decisive step forward beyond the bounds of modernity, suddenly discovers that in many regions of the world modernity has, it seems, plainly not yet even been approved and the modern era has not begun. And here the suspicion arises that maybe in these non-Western societies modernity in its customary European understanding is altogether impossible, and the modern era will never begin. This is the actor civilization, with all its pre-modern attributes. And if this actor is sufficiently strong and stable, the universalist and progressivist logic of the linear understanding of history, characteristic of the West, will be overthrown. The TMW in a certain sense proposes to carry this out, moving from the linear understanding of history to a cyclical one, from the common and single time of humanity to the special trajectories and paths of separate civilizational times, crisscrossing with one another in a complex and constantly changing pattern, demanding fixed attention. From here, we can take a further step and consider the postmodern international system, about which Buzyn and Little speak, as an open choice between continuing West-centric. If we follow universalist and West-centric views of history, the transition to a global international system is something irreversible and just for all societies of the world. Even where countries were originally included in this system as European colonies, they gradually receive independence and acquire national sovereignty. But that is only how things stand superficially. Under the thin film of the modernization of the political systems in the majority of non-Western countries, an entirely different socio-cultural model is preserved, corresponding as a rule to precisely the classical or ancient international system. Modernization is spread over the top layers of society, but the majority remain in a condition of traditional society. Thus, the former colonial societies that received independence are only formally sovereign, and, accordingly, only formally full-fledged actors of the Westphalian system. Essentially, they remain traditional societies, as before. Precisely this factor becomes apparent when a bipolar world collapses. From under the thin veneer of modernization, the contours of the real content of many socio-cultural regions appear. Here one detects the increasing significance and role of all the indicators that comprise the distinct features of traditional society, religion, ethics, the family, the ethnos, eschatology, etc. This is the phenomenon of the emergence of civilizations, when after the collapse of the structure of modernity, bipolarity, the content of pre-modernity arises, the clash or dialogue of civilizations. In the terms of the historical sociology approach in IR, this is described as the disclosure of the signs of a classical international system in the transition from a global international system to a postmodern one. The globalizing world, intending to take a decisive step forward beyond the bounds of modernity, suddenly discovers that in many regions of the world modernity has, it seems, plainly not yet even been approved and the modern era has not begun. And here the suspicion arises that maybe in these non-Western societies modernity in its customary European understanding is altogether impossible, and the modern era will never begin. This is the actor civilization, with all its pre-modern attributes. And if this actor is sufficiently strong and stable, the universalist and progressivist logic of the linear understanding of history, characteristic of the West, will be overthrown. The TMW in a certain sense proposes to carry this out, moving from the linear understanding of history to a cyclical one, from the common and single time of humanity to the special trajectories and paths of separate civilizational times, crisscrossing with one another in a complex and constantly changing pattern, demanding fixed attention. From here, we can take a further step and consider the postmodern international system, about which Buzyn and Little speak, as an open choice between continuing West-centric globalization, but only with the constant blurring of the vertical orientation of the hegemonic discourse of the West, and the multipolar project, in which there come into play forgotten, but newly awakening from anabiosis, structures of traditional society, i.e. civilizations, cultures, religions. If in the context of each international system meanings, actors, ties, and structures change, then the transition from the global system to the new system also implies shifts, demolitions, and replacements of identities and paradigms. It is not correct to apply modern criteria that have clearly lost their relevance to the postmodern system. But this means that the semantic horizons of the international system that is coming to replace the global system and is for now conditionally defined as postmodern remain open and problematic, and various segments of humanity can put up a tense and passionate fight for their formulation. This is an important point of the TMW. Postmodernism in IR is not predetermined and does not signify the transition from one approximately understood structure of international relations to another, also apprehended on the whole. It is rather an open process with uncertain outcomes, which can lead to one model of a world order, or to a completely different one with its own parameters. The postmodern can be the continuation of the modern, or it can represent an exit beyond the limits of the main logic of its development. This second variant of postmodernity provides a chance to build a multipolar world on the basis of civilizational pluralism. Another highly important theoretical point for the development of the TMW is the critique by members of the School of Historical Sociology, Hobson in particular, of the Eurocentrism and racism of all existing theories of IR. His book The Eurocentric Conception of World Politics is a fundamental theoretical contribution to the emergence of the TMW and can be wholly included in the context of this theory. On one hand, Hobson demonstrates the groundlessness of the identification of the Western system of values as universal, so that the Western system is announced as the highest and all other civilizational types and their value systems as lower, direct or subliminal racism, and, on the other hand, he proposes to construct a balanced and polycentric theory of IR, where Western civilization would be returned to its historical and provincial, from the perspective of the entire planet and all humanity, context. Hobson's ideas can be fully integrated into the TMW and can become its most important conceptual element. 9. The relevance of normativism to the TMW. Normativism in IR is very convenient for the thick analysis of civilizations and the structure of relations and ties among them. This approach puts at the center of attention the study of the norms, values, ideas, and ideals of concrete societies, with the help of which one attains a deep understanding of how the main themes of international relations are conceived of in various countries and social contexts. The normativistic approach suggests that each society conceives of and interprets models of world politics in accordance with cultural attitudes, norms. And these norms influence the political leadership and other centers of decision-making in foreign policy, since they are never torn out of the rest of the social milieu, but are connected with it and depend on it because of domestic considerations, the question of legitimacy. If separate lambda individuals, and even a plurality of them, lack competence in the sphere of international relations and in questions of foreign policy, their joint ideas can full well influence the legitimacy of the rules. Foreign policy is thus placed in a concrete socio-cultural context, and in this context symbols, preferences, attitudes, and ethnic complexes play an important role. In giving priority attention to models in the sphere of international relations, for instance, the figure of the other, and their resonance in a concrete society, normativists bring us right up to the composition of the civilizational map, where different societies project onto the international domain different complexes of moral criteria, ethnic assessments, imperatives, and rules. How this combines with concrete actual policies in each concrete case should be examined separately, but with this approach the entire sphere of zones of international relations becomes not a space for the application of power and economic technologies or institutional globalistic initiatives, but a field of symbols and signs, which different cultures and societies interpret differently, in accordance with their value complexes. Thus, opened up for the TMW is the broad expanse of the symbolic analysis of international relations on the basis of concrete civilizational ensembles, each of which is described though an original picture of norms and ideals. Another valuable aspect of normativism is the distinction between two ethical systems in IR, drawn in the works of the normativist Brown. The TMW starts from the fact that under multipolarity only a communitarian ethic should be regarded as normative, since each civilization bases its value system on its own criteria and principles, and even universality is understood differently each time, i.e. locally. The absence of a measure common to all civilizations, following from the civilizational relativism of the TMW, precludes the possibility of a grounded cosmopolitan ethic. And that which is advanced as such an ethic is upon closer examination found to be the universalization of the Western civilizational model. Thus, universalism and the globalism based on it prove to be only forms of colonialism, imperialism, and racism, i.e. the projection by one communitarian, historically and geographically predetermined, ethical system on all humanity. 10. The relevance of constructivism to the TMW. We have already spoken of the significance of constructivism for the TMW earlier. Most important in this approach is the attention given to theoretical constructions, which often have a special significance in the accomplishment of some or another project. Ideas about the world affect the world, and if they do not make it into the way it is thought about, they at least impart to it certain qualitative features. Consequently, the system of international relations is to a large extent a result of construction in the process of unfolding the theoretical field of IR as a discipline. Constructivists themselves, when in the first place, prefer to use this method in a humanistic, neoliberal spirit, pointing to the fact that much in IR depends on self-limiting formulations or conflicts pre-programmed by initial attitudes. Wendt thinks that the anarchy of international relations can be interpreted variously in the spirit of Hobbes, competition, preparedness for war, in the spirit of Locke, competition, peaceful contest, and in the spirit of Kant, solidarity, partnership, uniting into a single civil society. According to Wendt, this is ontologically one and the same anarchy, but its gnoseological evaluation allows it to be constructed on the basis of a field of enmity, a zone of competition, or a space of close cooperation in solidarity. How we configure our understanding of reality in international relations is how it will finally turn out. According to constructivists, we live in the world we ourselves create. Nicholas Onya formulates this idea in the title of his book, World of Our Making. But in the context of the TMW, we can draw on the basis of the constructive notion of the nature of international relations a conclusion that differs from the, on the whole, liberal orientation of constructivists themselves. They want to make the world more humane in the sense of a greater correspondence with the values they take as basic and self-evident in the context of Western modern and in part postmodern culture. But this is a world of their making. Non-Western civilizations fully logically prefer to make the world in accordance with their own attitudes and ideas, traditions, and cultural patterns. The Western world, claiming today to be the sole and universal model of the world, is made by the people of the West. They learn to deconstruct it and constitute it anew. This practice is critically important for the TMW. But it should be applied a new context and to resolve different problems. Having recognized that in the norms claiming self-evidence and universalism, technological progress, democracy, human rights, tolerance, humanism, the market economy, the free press, etc., we are dealing with the projections of only one civilization, what's more, with features inherent to only one historical phase of the civilization, we will be able to easily localize Western discourse, deconstruct it and free thereby a semantic field for the construction of another reality. The world made by us, not them, can and should be multipolar. And to become so, it remains only to be constructed. We should begin with theory, since the sources of what we start to apprehend and experience as a reality, a fact, and the status quo, begin precisely in the space of representations and concepts. An example of the analysis of a multipolar world in comparison with the postmodern international system. The proposed analysis of the international system leads to the distinction of the following levels: system, subsystem, unit, subunit, individual, and to the examination of their relations: military, political, economic, social, ambient. Also distinguished in an international system are: interaction, it can be linear or multi-ordinate, which determines the intensity of the interactions, which most often reduce to 5 types: war, union, trade, borrowing, and domination. Structure, the static model of organizing the unit in the system. Process, the qualitative transformation of all relations. According to Buzan and Little, the postmodern international system is characterized by the following features: expanding the list of basic units, compared to the global system, where the predominant actors were states. The emergence of non-state actors, right up to new units, asphalt nomads, Junger, Attali, the cosmopolitan entirely indifferent to the system of territorialized hierarchies. An even greater intensity of interrelations. The rise of new supranational spaces, information spaces, trade spaces, cultural spaces, network spaces, spaces of distribution, style spaces. Global interaction as dispersion, the dispersion of basic military political units into trade economic units. The emergence of new localities, regionalism. This picture of the postmodern international system, described by Buzan and Little, corresponds on the whole to the globalist vision and to the concepts of transnationalism and neoliberalism. Now let us describe by the same method the multipolar world. The global basic unit is the civilization, the poles of a multipolar world. This unit enters into a global system, based on intercivilizational interaction. A subsystem forms with the neighboring civilization, different each time depending on the civilization. There can be asymmetrical situations here. On the level of subunits, we encounter a spectrum of concepts, and the list of them can vary and be asymmetrical, partially hierarchical, partially juxtaposed. In the postmodern system, there is a coincidence here with multipolarity. In both there is a growth in the significance of local factors and a new regionalism. Thus, among subunits, we can distinguish the dominant socio-cultural community and minority communities. These minority communities can correspond to the dominant communities of other civilizations, or they can be unique. These communities can be structured by cultural, religious, ethnic, territorial, or other indicators, forming a superimposition of identities. Each of these identities can be identical to or differ from the dominant community and can have or lack a counterpart in other civilizations. Intercivilizational relations will take shape accordingly. The emergence of new or re-emergence of old communities, religious, ethnic, socio-cultural, and others, is a feature of the multipolar world. Relations among civilizations will form irregularly depending on what subunit we consider. Ties with separate religious or socio-cultural groups can develop very intensively. Among the dominant groups of civilizations, by contrast, ties and exchanges will likely be carried out in a rather limited sphere and through the mediation of specially appointed intermediaries. Instead of increasing the role of the individual actor, the asphalt nomad, multipolarity proposes to reduce individual identity to a minimum in favor of a diverse choice of asymmetric collective identities and sets of social statuses. The phenomenon of technology, claiming to be universal and culturally neutral, will be returned to its original historico-cultural context and recognized as a specific gadget of only one civilization, as an expression of its hegemonic pretensions and ethnocentric impulse. Comparing the models of the postmodern system, put forward by historical sociologists in IR, and shared on the whole by transnationalists, globalists, and neoliberals, with the model of a multipolar world, we see fundamental differences in the picture of the future. In one case, among typical postmodernists, we are dealing with the transpositions of the contemporary Western code onto a more and more atomized individual level. In the second case, humanity recombines and reorganizes on the basis of holism collective identity, although the structure of this identity, the interactions among various groups and processes, reflecting the constant change of these interactions, will be dynamic, not reducible to the classical international system, the global one, or the one that historical sociologists in IR call postmodern, in their neoliberal and transnational versions. At the same time, the significant semantic dimension of the nature of the unit in comparison with the global system, where the basic unit was the nation-state, can in the TMW be likened to the difference between the elementary particles of classical physics and fractals, Mandelbrot, or loops, in Witten's superstring theory. Civilization is a complex reality with a very complicated and always unique geometry and a system of strange attractors. Hence, the system of international relations such as war, union, exchange, borrowing, and domination also acquires a complex character. Intercivilizational war will be something fundamentally different from wars between states, in essence and in form. Also different will be the union of civilization, or the nature of peace agreements. The character of exchange, including economic exchange, will be defined by the level on which these operations occur. In a civilization, these can be rather diverse authorities and groups, in contrast to the state-centric conception in the classical paradigms of IR or atomic individuals and groups in neoliberalism and Neo-Marxism. Finally, the dominance of one civilization over another can also have an ambivalent character. Material superiority will not always imply cognitive superiority and gnoseological hegemony. And, by contrast, Spiritual dominance can in separate cases be accompanied by a lag in material development. The multipolar world leaves all possibilities maximally open. We can draw an important conclusion from this: the multipolar world is the space of maximally open history, where the animated participation of societies in the creation of a new world, a new map of reality, will not be limited by any external bounds, any hegemony, any reductionism or universalism, any rules pre-established or imposed by some side. This multipolar reality will be much more complex, complicated, and multidimensional than any postmodern intuitions. The multipolar world is a manufactured space of practically unlimited historical freedom, the freedom of peoples and communities themselves to make their own history. Summary. The following table summarizes the main similarities and differences between the TMW and other paradigms of IR. Paradigm. Similarities. Differences. Realism: sovereignty of actors, anarchy of international relations. Actor is not the nation-state but civilization/politeia. Neorealism. Balance of powers: hegemony rejects the global hegemony of the West, rejects bipolarity. Liberalism: integration and supranational institutionalization on the basis of shared values, rejects the priority of liberal democracy, denies the universality of Western values. Neoliberalism. Rejects globalization and transnationalism. Marxism/Neo-Marxism: the critique of global capitalism denies the universality of phases of development, rejects the necessity of a global world system. Critical theory. The critique of Western and capitalist hegemony, contra-hegemony, rejects individualism, marginalism, anarchism as values, contra-social. Postmodernism. Deconstructing the global will to power, rejects the devaluation of the will to power as such. Feminism: deconstructing gender masculinism and exclusivism in IR. Taking female gender into account in culture and civilization. Standpoint: feminism rejects liberal feminism, straightforward egalitarianism, the legalization of same-sex marriage, the relativization and ontologization of sex. Historical sociology: anti-racism, anti-Eurocentrism, the historicity of societies and international systems, the critique of tempocentrism and chronocentrism, building non-Western IR theory. Normativism: the priority of norms and values in defining civilizations, communitarian ethic. Rejects cosmopolitan ethic. Constructivism: the constructed character of the object of IR, deconstruction/reconstruction. Rejects subliminal Eurocentrism.